Why did you write your book in the third single person?
Third person. Well, I didn't start out doing it that way. I started out writing it in the first person, which is obviously the more automatic decision when you're writing an autobiography. And the truth is, I just didn't like it. I didn't like the tone of voice of it. It felt, I don't know, felt narcissistic. All so much me. Well, is that it would be necessary in the book to be very self-critical. Books like Schindler's List by Thomas Keneally, for example, or like The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer, books which take completely true stories, but use the techniques of literature, to use the techniques of fiction to tell that story. It's kind of surprising that I emerged from this long period of pressure, reasonably sane, if that's what you think I am. It would have been more probable, perhaps, that I would come out of it with some kind of psychological damage, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm happy to discover that I was more resilient an individual than I would have given myself credit for being. But one of the things that really was interesting when I went back to read the journals that I had kept in those years, which I had not looked at for many years, was that it became obvious that the person writing the journal had been quite often in a very bad state of mind. And I had sort of forgotten that. But so to go back and read those journals again was really to rediscover how, in a way, how bad the pressure had been and how deep an effect it had had on me during those years. Think about my close friendships amongst writers, After the book was finished, I showed it to my friend Ian McEwan, who was, again, one of the early readers of the book. And he said to me that he felt about the attack on the Satanic Verses, that it had been important not just for me, but for our whole generation. I think, the resistance to the fatwa was a collective act, and one of the things I wanted to portray in the book was that collective act, the act of a whole community of friends and colleagues responding to a threat. People's continued interest in the period of the fatwa was, in a way, getting in the way of them looking at the work that I was actually doing, is all of it. It's not exactly therapy. It's more that I had to reach a point at which I had come to terms with this part of my life before I could write the book. And I wanted to wait until I felt that I was in that place, in order to tell the story. And now you never have to ask me again, because everything is in here. How shall I put it? Every so often, somebody in Iran stands up and shakes a fist in my direction. Mm-hmm. That still happens. But at this point, it's very largely rhetorical rather than real. Really, the threat that there was against not just me, but against all the other people who were threatened by the fatwa, had nothing to do with money. It had to do with professional assassins in the employment of the Iranian regime. And that's a very serious threat. To have kind of hired professional killers who are being dispatched around the world to carry out these threats. All the attacks that we know about, the attacks on the Italian translator, Ettore Capriolo, the murder of the Japanese translator, Professor Igarashi, the shooting of the Norwegian publisher, William Nygaard, all these attacks, when you look at the characteristics of the attack, and in fact when they were studied by the local police of those countries, it was quite clear that these were not amateurs. These were professionals. Expressing that question is, what should be our response to the threat of violence? And I think no matter how absurd the initial text might have been, which I think in the case of this YouTube video, it clearly was a piece of, very unpleasant piece of work. But the threat of violence changes the subject. At that point, the subject becomes, how do we respond to violence? And if we give in to it, we guarantee that there will be more violence. We don't end the violence by surrendering to it. We simply guarantee that violence will increase. You know? So once the subject of violence arises, it seems to me not anymore to be a free speech issue. It seems to me to be a question of how does a society defend itself against a violent threat. And that must always be by resisting it, always. I mean, as to the question of offensive speech, frankly, if you want to find something to offend you on YouTube, you will find it. And there's an enormous amount of material on YouTube that is offensive to many different kinds of people. The right thing to say is that the answer to words must always be other words. If you don't like what I say, answer. You know, if you want to argue with something that upsets you, then put your point of view. You know, the answer to words should be words. It should not be bombs, you know, or bullets. That's an inappropriate answer. And maybe this is a lesson that some parts of the Islamic world still have to learn.